Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Effortless Conversations. This week we have with us Erinn Larkin, People Operations Manager at Princeton Mortgage. Thanks for joining us today, Erinn. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what a People Operations Manager does?
So a People Operations Manager is sort of like the new age version of HR. I think that HR has this really terrible reputation of like the fun police and just like focusing on policies. And People Operations really tries to bring back the humanistic approach to a business and focusing more on training and development, culture creation, and really creating an environment that is collaborative and where you are utilizing the whole person instead of just like their one skill set or what you might find on their resume.
So you're more interested in the person themselves versus their job title and what comes along with that?
Yeah, it's about creating a space where people are engaged and where they're happy to be. I think that there's a ton of data out there that supports that when people are happy and they feel fulfilled in more than one area of their life, they're more likely to have higher productivity, lower call-outs, things like that.
That makes sense. Do you think that Do you think HR got its negative connotation from Toby in The Office?
I've not seen The Office.
I had to ask. I couldn't help myself.
I've never seen The Office, but I think that part of the rebranding of HR is the name itself. I mean, human resources is so robotic. It makes you think of something that you would see just on like an income statement or a balance sheet as just something that you can move around within the organization with like a financial cost instead of thinking more about the holistic approach.
Yeah, that is strange. I've never really put much thought into that, but human resources does make it sound kind of like dystopian.
Yeah, it's like you have your tech resources, you have like these admin, and then it's just like humans, like our persons, the bodies in our space.
That's so funny. So it's like, so it seems like what you guys have done is like take the classic model of HR and really expand it to say like, well, yeah, we're concerned about, we want to make sure that you're thriving in your job, but also that you're thriving personally.
Correct.
That's really cool. So like when you come across somebody that you notice, like, is this more toward like the beginning of someone starting this job, or does it go throughout their entire time here that you're focused on? Like, are you have your finger on the pulse of kind of everybody at Princeton, or is it?
The intention is to really, I view HR or people operations as a tool belt in leadership in the management team's belt, like a tool that's to be utilized. So if someone has an employee relation matter that they need help working through, like I would want them to come to me so we can talk through what a solution to that might be, or if a team member has a dilemma that they're trying to work through, that we would have a conversation about that. And so it really is designed to go through the whole life cycle of someone's employment, from recruiting and talent and finding the person that's going to fit the culture and stay engaged and be happy in that environment, all the way through to assisting them when they offboard. And there's a lot of like offboarding resources that a company could offer to help transition, and we do some of those things like a letter of recommendation or giving references when someone has chosen their next employer.
That's really interesting. I never would have thought that there was much focus on offboarding at a company. Mm-hmm. What kind of walk me through that a little bit? What does that look like?
So the offboarding process for us includes a survey. So we ask team members to go through and just give really candid feedback about their experience at Princeton, what prompted them to leave the company, if they had reached out and started a conversation prior to making that decision to leave, so that we can utilize that data to improve the way that we operate when someone is still employed with us. I give that to them via survey because sometimes people feel more comfortable writing down their thoughts than they feel communicating them in person. Right. But then I also do an exit interview with that person, and I like to have the survey first so that if I see any red flags, I can drill down into that and like, where did we go wrong here? Like, how did you start to feel this way? And then on the flip side, some people feel more comfortable like having a conversation and telling me things that they don't want like documented forever. So we go through that data collection really. and then we supply them with everything that they need to know about like returning their equipment. There's also a lot of questions about like benefits and like, where do I stand now? Is my family still covered through the end of the month? What do I do with my 401k? Can I transition it over to an IRA? Or again, letting people know whether or not they're eligible for rehire or not, so that they know whether or not to utilize us as a reference when they go to their next employer and that sort of thing.
It's really interesting. I never would have put much thought into the offboarding process.
That's what we do.
Yeah, that's really cool. So is this model that you guys are using, where it's this kind of expanded HR model, is this something that you see standard across most companies these days, or are some people kind of struggling to keep up with that, or still sticking with that more archaic model?
I think that Princeton has done a really good job of creating a space where people can specialize in some of these different areas within people operations. We have Olivia who handles the whole onboarding process, so that's like a really tailored experience for each person that onboards with us. And then Cheryl is like an expert when it comes to those benefits and payroll. And so as companies get bigger, you do tend to see those functions siloed a bit. So I wouldn't say that we are unconventional in our structure, but I would say that our approach to people is less common and a little bit more modern. Princeton certainly does not view people as just a number, and there's a lot of thought that goes into the employee experience, and no decision is made without compassion as it relates to each person.
Okay. And so you came here pretty recently, right? And so was this a model that was in place before you got here, or have you kind of helped expand that since you come to Princeton? Or is that something that drew you to Princeton originally?
That's something that drew me to Princeton. So I'm not really interested in working for an employer that already has like a really robust HR, people operations department already created. I was more focused on being a part of that process of creating, so that I could lend some of my experience and expertise in that development. When I got here, however, it seems as though each of those different functions that I spoke to reported to different people, so they didn't really fall under one umbrella. So for the first time, we have operations, recruiting, the onboarding, and the payroll and benefits all under one house, and it really creates a more collaborative space than what I understand existed before here.
It sounds like more of a brain trust you guys have going on.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So you speak like some of your experience beforehand and everything. Were you in the mortgage industry before this, or was it a different kind of company? Or
no, so when I was interviewing at Princeton, I was like, straight up, I have no mortgage experience, but I have people experience, and I can support people regardless of the industry. It just takes some time to learn the titles, what a processor does, what an underwriter does, and I'm certainly still learning that. I've been with the company just shy of 4 months. So certainly still a learning curve there.
Yeah, I'm sure it's wild. I mean, I'm right there with you. I'm still trying to place people in departments and what job goes where and everything. So I can't imagine. I mean, I'm sure that the tree that you're dealing with all the time is just massive. So while we're backing up a little bit and talking about your previous experience, why don't we go way back and tell me about, have you always been interested in human resources, the robotic human resources?
We can call it HR.
Okay, have you always been interested in helping people with professionally?
I would love to sit here and be like, I just fell into HR, but like, I'm very much one of those people whose like career path was very intentional and very like methodical. So when I finished my bachelor's degree, I knew that I wanted to work in an organization in some capacity in like a people-oriented way. I was more focused at that time on public relations, and so my degree was in organizational communications. And then I did my master's degree in public administration, and that's where I really started to dabble in some HR coursework. But at that time, I was in property management in an office manager capacity, so I was gaining a lot of experience with like payroll and some of the benefits. And then I just like stayed married to that idea of like, I'm gonna get a job in HR, I'm going to make that progression. And I went into recruiting and then made the transition over to HR management about 6 years ago. Okay.
I'm sure dealing with tenants as a property manager kind of helped you get some rough experience with dealing with people, huh?
Yeah, it really, I reflect back on some of the conversations I've had with tenants, and it's just, I think that that's where I really learned the ability to be like, these are the rules, and like, as much as sometimes the person's situation is like really terrible or like whatever it may be, at the end of the day, like, I'm here to support the business, and we will not be a functional business if we make exceptions left and right to all of these policies. And I know that that sounds like really callous and really cold, but I can't look at just the individual, because these decisions, if we were to start to get like crazy, it could mean a huge impact on like all of the other people for the company. So I'm always very mindful of like maintaining a compliant route for the company and like protecting the business from that perspective.
And that's a delicate line to walk, because you're the face of the company, but you're also having to deliver the bad news that like maybe we can't do exactly what you need for your situation.
And well, I think that that's where, like, when I mentioned being a tool for managers, that in my opinion, like, that's really information that should be coming from someone's manager, and then I'm sort of in the background, like, helping to navigate that conversation and coach through those difficult conversations, so that it doesn't ruin that like safe space almost for coming to someone in HR with a viable complaint or anything like that. If you've had like a negative, if you go to HR and you're like, can I have like 25 extra hours of PTO, and I have to be like, no, you can't, like, we have a policy for that, then that person might not want to come talk to me later when they're like, hey, I have this like legitimate issue that I want to file a complaint or what have you.
Right. So back to your time as a project or a property manager.
Yeah.
Do you have like one particular story that sticks in your mind that you like are like, oh man, I'm glad I'm not doing that anymore?
Oh my gosh, I have so many.
I want to hear one.
Well, first of all, when I first moved to Charleston, I had been in commercial property management at the time, so like leasing out office spaces. And when I came down here, I landed what I thought was going to be like the best like property manager role at this apartment community that was in North Charleston. And I showed up there on my first day, and I was like, I got bamboozled. Like, this is a terrible part of town. I was new to Charleston, so I had no idea. The people who were formerly in that office, like the property had just been acquired, were literally let go on Friday, and then my team walked in on Monday. So like the property of like 350 units, no one had any idea that their management company was changing. So when they came to pay rent, it was like all new faces. Someone threw a brick through our office window. They
welcome to North Charleston.
Mess up the space. I had one resident who got into a fight with her boyfriend, and they were on the second story, and he was like walking out angrily on the first floor, and she leaped off her balcony with a knife and stabbed him in the shoulder.
Oh Lord.
I also had a resident, I was 9 months pregnant, and my husband was away for the Army, and I got a phone call at like 2 o'clock in the morning. Someone had left a pot on their stove and left, and it caught fire. And so when I drove up to the property, like this whole building of like 30 or 40 units, everyone was out in the streets. The fire department was there. Everyone's like, are we going to get hotels? Or like, what are we? And I'm like ready to give birth at any moment.
Oh Lord.
It was wild.
So you didn't go into labor, did you?
I didn't.
Okay.
That would have been a great story.
Did you have to? Yeah, it would have been. Did you have to get everybody hotels?
We didn't. Thankfully, the fire was contained to that one apartment unit, so like we did have to wait a very long time for everyone to get access back into the building. But
I'm sure. Yeah, there was a fire at an apartment complex near where I live not too long ago, and they're still trying to clean it out. That's what I cannot even imagine. So I'm sure like moving into a more corporate space was a little bit of a relief.
Certainly.
Yeah, you're not dealing with crazy tenants jumping off of balconies and stabbing their boyfriends.
This is also one of my favorite stories. That apartment community I worked at, we had a family in a second story unit that didn't speak very good English, and they had a water leak, but due to their inability to like communicate, they didn't feel comfortable reporting their water leak, so they just didn't. And we had a courtesy officer, a police officer who lives, which is never a good sign. Like if an apartment community is like, we have 5 courtesy officers, that's no good. My courtesy officer came home at the end of night shift, and like the ceiling of the second story apartment had fallen through, like their bathroom was in his his unit.
Oh, what a nightmare. Like toilet, bathtub, everything.
Yeah, just like, he was like, I just want to go to bed. Like, I'm tired. My shift is over. We did have to pay. We moved him into a different apartment.
That's a nightmare. I had a similar story when I just moved into the townhouse that we live in right now. I had hooked up the washing machine wrong, and the washing machine's on the second floor. And water was, unbeknownst to me, just creeping throughout the floor. And then one night, I used to work in the film industry, so I would get off at 4 or 5 a.m. and I was sitting in my chair at 5 a.m. and I just heard like water dripping. And I didn't know what was going on, and I turned around and I just saw water dripping right out of the ceiling. And I walked over there and I looked at it, and as I stood underneath it, it just caved onto me. Luckily, the washing machine didn't fall through the floor onto me. Just the ceiling broke, and all the water that had been sitting in there fell. What a nightmare! I can't imagine.
That happened to me actually too.
Really?
We cloth diaper our kids, and so it has like, our toilet has like the attachment for like a diaper sprayer. And my husband was working night shift, and I thought that I'd like turned off the water I swear I turned it off. Like, I think that thing was loose and like came
This
back.
is still a point of contention, huh?
Yes, it's still. Well, it happened twice.
Okay.
So what I'm about to tell you happened twice. So my husband's like, "This is you, Erinn. This is not an accident." And so we like put the diaper sprayer up in this like vase on the back of the toilet, and I like went to bed and everything. And my husband got home from night shift and like walked in our front door, and it was flooded. The first floor was flooded, and he looked up and there was a light fixture just pouring water. Like, it had just run all night. And he was so livid, but like I said, it happened twice.
Same light fixtures, same everything?
Same everything. And I'm like, this isn't me. And then I went back to like, who installed the diaper sprayer? Not me. You know?
That's a good way to do it. Just back up a little bit. See, I think the problem was when it was put in.
Root cause analysis here.
Right.
Faulty diaper sprayer installment.
That's great. So just don't let Erinn come to your house to wash your diapers. So we've spoken a little bit about the new and improved HR and kind of how you guys will build culture. Can you speak a little bit about how, because Princeton prides itself on its culture and the culture that they preach, and they do live it. And I'm curious kind of like how, what's that process like when someone comes on and you're like explaining the culture to them, like how, like walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think you have to back up a little bit, because speaking to culture really starts during the interview process. And we, the recruiting team, try to be really, really transparent and upfront about what to expect here. It doesn't do anyone it's no good for anyone to like lie about what your first day or your first year would look like and have someone be unhappy. So we really start navigating that conversation during the interview process. And I like to give people a little bit of time to resonate with what I've told them, because one of the things that I love about Princeton is that a lot of common workplace complaints that people have has been resolved here at Princeton. Like, we have a solution for that. But the solution doesn't look like what a lot of people would think about. When you hear people talk about like, oh, my workplace is so toxic, I wish I worked someplace that didn't have that. Well, no one really stops to think, what does an environment how do you get to a non-toxic environment? How do you stop that sort of thing? And at Princeton, it's radical candor and transparency. And so as much as people might say, I want like a workplace free of gossip, well, are you prepared for the alternative, which is hearing a lot of feedback and being very transparent about what's going on and how you're doing? And I try to present it in that way of like, is that something that could really work for you? The other thing that Princeton does is we use our rules of the game to really drive our decision making. And when we were just recently doing our leadership event, we practice going through with our rules of the game and presenting different scenarios that have happened here at Princeton, and do these lists of 8 or 9 values, give us an answer on how to move forward with whatever situation we're dealing with. And everything that we came up with, they did. Now, granted, that's a living document, and so as we find ourselves in situations that are unanswered, we'll have to reevaluate. And that's really how it should be. It shouldn't just be like a list that goes up on the wall of your office space, and we say there are values and no one ever talks about it or speaks to it. But going back a little bit, when you onboard, like I said, that conversation is starting right at the beginning. We do culture training during your first week with Mark, our CRO, who goes through what those values are and what that looks like. Rich, our CEO, is getting in front of the team every month for an all-hands meeting and really speaking to that. Managers, again, going back to the decision making, are reinforcing the way that we're moving forward or the things that we're doing with the why, and the why is the value.
Okay. And so you speak of the rules of the game as kind of like a living document. It's almost kind of like the Constitution, I would say, of Princeton Mortgage. So what are the rules of the game? Is that a crazy question for me to ask you that? Like what? Give me a general outline. Like if when you're looking at a situation and you're referencing the rules, and can you give me a scenario?
Yeah. So the number one rule is to be all in, and I think that being number one is really critical, because you really can't follow through with any of our other values unless you are all in. And what that means is be committed, be present, always be putting your best foot forward when it comes to Princeton and your role and your responsibility. So like whatever you're going to commit to it wholeheartedly. That's number one. Some of the other values are, like I said, be the radical candidness and transparency. So that's something that we all need to be able to both give and receive, and that is an adjustment.
And radical candor is kind of like just giving and accepting feedback, right? Just like true feedback. You're not talking about it with other people. You're going right to the source.
And instead of becoming defensive when you receive that feedback. So I know the leadership and management team was practicing that for a while, just giving and receiving feedback, because if you can't receive it well, then you can't give it well. And so you need to be comfortable with both sides of that. So that's one of them. Be the CEO of your own life. I find that value to be very empowering. Everyone here can take ownership of any problem that they're facing. This is not an environment where if you're faced with a situation or a challenge that you get to just sit back and be like, I don't know what to do, I can't solve this, so it's like not my issue to deal with. It's like you found the problem, so you're the problem solver. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of autonomy given to people to find a solution and to move forward, and we're not a company that is like married to titles and like this structure of hierarchy that you're afraid to step outside. So the CEO of your own life.
So there's really no stay in your lane here at Princeton. It's not like, because when I was working on film sets, everything was very departmentalized, and it was like, if I was working in costumes and props came over, you'd be like, stay in your lane. This isn't your deal.
But but can't like costumes be considered a prop?
Okay, well, if we want to get into the
I'm like asking,
you can get into the nuances. So like when you get into it, like costumes handles clothes, like helmets are props, watches are props.
Helmets wouldn't be a part of a costume.
Helmets are props, watches are props.
What if you're an astronaut?
Rings are costumes. Well, rings are props unless it's an engagement ring, then it's costumes.
That's a weird distinction.
There's a lot of really weird nuance. So it's like there's a lot of opportunity to say, hey, not my problem.
Yeah.
So it's new for me coming into this, where it's like any problem that comes up, anybody in the company has the ability to stop the assembly. Like, that was one of the things with Toyota when they were building their assembly line, is like they had this great assembly line, but the way that they the distinction was that anybody on the line was able to hit the button and stop the line and say, here's a problem that we need to fix, where that wasn't the case on most places, and it would slow stuff down, but they were able to start really pumping out cars, and that's just a classic example of that. So it's nice to be in a place where anybody at any point can identify a problem and stop the line and say, hey, look, this needs to be addressed. I'll fix it, but this is why the line is stopped.
It doesn't always have to be a problem, right? It can also be like an innovative idea or a solution or like something else that you're like, hey, what can we like try this? And more often than not, if you make a good business case for it, like why not? Yeah,
and it can come from anywhere. That's been one thing to learn too, is like, anybody can have a great idea.
Right.
And a lot of times you're so close to what you're working on that somebody outside of that is going to have a better idea. And so it's nice to know that is, realized by the management, in a company. It's
for sure.
It's a nice change. So speaking of like, radical candor is a term that's thrown around a lot. And I know we just spoke about like giving and receiving feedback, but that is something it's a muscle that you have to grow. And so is that something that you guys really help, I don't want to call it HR, people operations?
Yeah.
Is that something that you guys at people ops, like, you really try to coach that? Like if you hear from somebody that somebody's getting really defensive with feedback, like will you reach out to them and say, hey, look, like what's going on?
That's the intention.
Okay.
That if a manager doesn't feel equipped to handle that conversation themselves, that they would come to me or anyone else on the people ops team to talk through some problem solving there. But we would certainly like to get to a point where we are implementing more trainings focused on our culture, how to grow some of these muscles that people are maybe underdeveloped for some people. And I think Princeton, coming to Princeton is like getting out of a bad relationship. So people bring with them like so many bad behaviors or like concepts about what to expect from their employer because we are so different, that it takes time to like, you're not going to get fired if you go to your boss and say like, hey, your communication style isn't really like working with me, and I receive feedback a lot better if you presented it X, Y, Z way. Like that's welcome, that's encouraged, like you have an obligation to share that. But getting someone used to the idea that like, we're not going to fire you for saying that. Like there's like a ramp up period to getting accustomed to working at Princeton.
Yeah, for sure. I can identify with that. So when you're speaking with somebody in the interview process and you're kind of like outlining the culture, are you reading their face to kind of like see if you say, be the CEO of your own life and you explain that, do you kind of like read their face to see like, oh, they think I'm full of crap, or they this is something they're not used to? Like, will you kind of like go harder on that, like more explain that more and kind of try to get them more comfortable?
Yeah, I try to come out of the gate with some of the values that are a little bit different for people to adjust to see how they handle that. Again, a lot of people, like if I were to just come to someone and say, hey, wouldn't it be great to work someplace where like no one ever gossips about one another? They're going to be like, yeah, absolutely, I love that. Like that's what I've been looking for. Like that's exactly why I'm leaving my company. But if I go to someone and I'm like, hey, are you comfortable like sharing that type of feedback with your boss or with a peer? Like, would you be comfortable if you were on a phone call with someone and started to say how John never emails you back, if John was like 3-wayed in, sharing that feedback directly with John, and then suddenly it's like, well, yeah, I could do that, like that, and they'll sort of answer that way. Or there's someone that's just like, yeah, absolutely. Like if I'm allowed to do that, I would love to do that, Yeah,
it's funny to see how many people have just had it drilled into them that you cannot give negative feedback up the chain. Mm-hmm. It goes against, I feel like, how you're trained almost.
Or it's receiving it too. So another, like doing a lot of exit surveys for previous companies, a lot of people often say like, I have no idea where I stand with my manager. Like I never know if I'm doing well. I only talk to my manager once a month. Like I have no idea if I would have a right to ask for more money because I don't know if I'm doing well or if I'm meeting my manager's expectations. And so, again, it's like, well, what does the opposite of that look like? Where you're constantly getting feedback, where everything is laid on the table, where you're having a meeting weekly to have those conversations. Like, there's a huge distinction between wanting to just like be the victim of these previous employer situations and wish that you had it differently, versus really leaning into and stepping into what that alternative could look like.
Right, and one thing that I think really kind of speaks to that is the weekly one-on-ones that are within the company. Here at Princeton Mortgage, every week you have a one-on-one with your manager, and so, like I remember when I first started, I dreaded my one-on-ones because I was like, first of all, I felt overwhelmed with all the stuff I was learning. I didn't think that I was keeping up with everybody else. And I would dread these one-on-ones. But then you get into the habit of radical candor, of saying like exactly how you're feeling, exactly what you need, and your manager tells you the same thing, and you just like, instead of taking it and getting defensive, you say, okay, this is what I need to do. I had a previous English professor who went and did a silent retreat in California for like a month where there's absolutely no speaking. Interesting.
And she said when she came out of that she like learned a lot about herself because she was in there like doing yoga and like all of these things, and like in her brain was like formulating these stories about people that she's never spoken to, like, wow, that girl looked at me weird, like, why doesn't she like me? She must not like me, like these sort of things. And it, over the course of the month, it was like getting comfortable with yourself and then also realizing like
how much we make up in our head. And like I see that sort of happen in the workplace too. Like when I had a one-on-one with my manager, and I was like, I feel like I'm doing a really terrible job. But also, based on our culture, like I know you would have told me that, and you haven't told me that, so like I must not be. But like we get used to like no feedback also means that like you might be doing terrible. We're used to that too.
Yeah, you really do write these own stories in your head. I had something happen recently where I had a couple things go wrong, and then my manager changed my one-on-one to like early in the morning one day, and I was like, oh great, they're just gonna let me go first thing in the morning. And then it wasn't anything like that. It was she had something else going on in the afternoon, and I was like, why? I got myself totally freaked out. You really do. You'll like take the bare amount of the bare minimum information and build this whole story that's like against you.
Yeah.
And then it is nice to have that once a week check in, like, okay, they had a lot of feedback. I need to step it up, and and then you're doing a great job, and then but for the past week I've thought that I've been doing awful. It's nice to know where you stand, which is something 100%. That you don't get at most companies, and I've never gotten at the film.
Which is why you go into that meeting thinking it's a problem,
right?
Instead of thinking like that it could be something good, because we're so like, if we don't hear from someone, that's funny.
And the repeated process of this, it really does help your brain stop with all that negativity, because you're like, I'm working myself up for no reason. Like, so this is going to be fine. And even if it's not fine, it'll be fine, because I'm going to be a player and not a victim, which is another thing that Princeton speaks on a lot. Do you want to talk a little bit about player versus victim mentality?
So that is I spoke to that a little bit more about like when people are complaining about previous employers, like just setting back and accepting that like everything is just happening to you and you have no control over it. Being a player is really leaning into the situation, and again, going back to what we spoke to with like, here's a problem. I'm the CEO of my own life. I can take this and I can handle it and I can move forward to it. Like I have control over what's happening, or maybe in the outcome or some of the decision-making process. So instead of just allowing everything, like allowing things to happen to you, just like taking charge of all of that.
And that's something that, do you kind of, when you're like back to the interview process, when you're telling people about this and you're reading their face, like can you kind of pick out people that are not going to thrive here, or like?
Oh yeah, when it comes to the victim mindset, you can hear it most easily when you ask someone why they're looking for a job, because you'll hear a lot of people speak to like, I was so overworked at my last company, or like there were all these organizational problems, and like they'll present all of these situations, and then I'll ask like, well, what recommendations did you make to solve that problem? Or like and some people will say, there was just like a lot of red tape and I made these recommendations and it just like fell on deaf ears and didn't go anywhere. Or you'll hear someone be like, well, that's not really my place to like say that, so I didn't say that, or just like create more excuses versus taking charge of that. So you can hear it a little bit, but that's the easiest question to ask.
Interesting. So when you're reading someone's response on something like that, and you can tell that they have been living in the victim mentality at their last job, like, does it seem to you like, okay, this is somebody I'm gonna have to work on, or is it like this person probably not gonna be Princeton material?
I think it depends on the totality of the situation. Like, has the company that they're currently with gone through a lot of growth, and maybe that created some of these problems? Was this just like an individual having a really hard time with their manager? It's really, I would really have to look at the whole conversation.
It seems very nuanced. It seems like, and it seems like your career path like has kind of led you right where you need to be. Like it seems like it's a good fit for you.
But also like the interview process is just really flawed.
Okay, can you speak about it a little bit?
Yeah, that's not Princeton specific, but like the interview process, like we're having a conversation, 30 minutes to an hour, maybe several conversations over the course of a few weeks, and it's like we base such a big decision on like really such an elementary practice. Like anyone can say anything. I'm especially suspicious when I interview other like recruiters or other people in the HR space, because I'm like, you interview everyone all the time. I'm like super suspicious of any answer that you give me right now. But it's just not a good way to see how someone is going to do under pressure, how likely they are to learn and take on new initiatives and new practices. Like,
are they going to sit here and tell me that they were just in like this lousy situation and they are ready to be a player and switch their mindset? Like, are they true to that? Will that really happen? And there's different assessments and things that you can do to try to figure that out. But that's why if you are utilizing tools outside of just an interview, like you can't just pick one. Like, you can't just look at an assessment and go, okay, this person is or isn't a good fit, or just look at their resume without an interview, unless you're really just basing it off of years of experience.
Okay. And so to go back to kind of what you were saying, like, since this is a problem that you've identified, what are you doing to change that?
I think that the more information you collect, the better. We are looking at transitioning over to hiring committees versus just one person or one main person having the majority decision making, and also including someone in the hiring process who's not in that department, so they can just have like a really objective opinion on the person, their background, how well they think they're going to fit with what they know that team to need. So we can trial and error a few different things. There's also a concept of just eliminating all decision-making authority from a hiring manager, because they're going to be most desperate for finding someone, and sometimes when a position's been open for a long time, they're just like, this person works, like we'll get them in there. And so if you take that decision from them, then it relies on everyone else who's maybe a little less biased. We're also looking at some predictive analytic tools when it comes to our positions like processing and underwriting, where we can build out profiles based on our top 3 performers in those positions. And when someone applies, we'll be able to look at how well they fit within that profile. If it's like a really easily defined role where it's like, we know this is what has been successful, like how similar to that person are they? But that wouldn't work in a role that requires a lot of creativity or a lot of decision making. So you just have to play around with a few different approaches based on the position. That's
interesting. So it's almost like the analogy that it brings to mind is like the BAU, it's the behavioral analysis unit, is like where, you know, with criminal profilers, how they're like, well, this is the profile of this criminal, this is what they're going to be. You guys kind of do the same thing but tailor it toward jobs. Say like, kind of like, this is the kind of person that we need who fits this mold.
Yeah, it's really successful in things like sales positions too, because yes, everyone is an individual and they're likely to respond to things differently, but there are key attributes that are like proven to be successful in certain positions, specifically sales, that it's like, you probably have to be really outgoing, like you have to be organized or what have you. So it just, again, it's just another data point. It's not something that you can base your whole decision on.
It's interesting. This has been an enlightening conversation, because I've always wondered what all goes into these decisions when it comes to hiring and offboarding and stuff like that. It's good to know that there is like so much consideration that goes across the board. Yeah. I mean, it's been very cool to hear you talk about it. I have an icebreaker question that I usually try to ask toward the beginning, and I'm going to tailor this one for you because I know you're not really a big movie TV watcher.
Yeah. You sound so lame.
I don't. I'm not trying to make you sound lame. You are awesome. But this is a question that I used to try to ask at the beginning, but lately I've been asking it toward the end because we've been getting into the meat a little bit. But just to let people get to know your deal a little bit. What would you say your favorite book is and why?
Would you have asked if like my favorite movie?
Yeah, I would have asked your favorite movie, but I mean, book is just as good.
Well, I absolutely will not pick a favorite book.
Okay. All right. So. All right, let me re-ask.
But I'll tell you why.
Tell me why.
Okay. I find I like to read historical books, and so I'm always learning about like different people or different time periods, and I like just can't pick one specific person. I feel like for me to pick a favorite book would be to pick a favorite like historical figure or period in time, and I just like won't do that.
Okay.
There are certain books that I like really enjoy and recommend to people. Lately, it's a little bit older at this point, but like I've been recommending The Devil in the White City by Erinn.
I love that book.
It's such a good book,
Such a cool
right?
book, yes.
It's like a good cut for people who like, when I say historical, they're like, oh wow, like that sounds so boring. It's like, that's like a good dabble with like the World Fair and H.H. Holmes.
Oh, and just how unsupervised Chicago was, and people just disappearing. Yeah. I mean, that's a wild story. Good choice. So, okay, so Devil in the White City.
Is one like, I find that one's like a good introduction to
Definitely.
people.
I love anything Eric Larson. He's great.
What's your other favorite Eric?
Yeah, now you're going to put me on the spot here because I know I've read at least 2 of his other books, and I cannot name them right now.
Thunderstruck?
No? Give me another one.
There's one of them about like. There's one about the like one of the ships coming over from.
See, now I'm embarrassed now but I have read Eric Larson, and I'm gonna have to look at his list of titles because I know I've read like 3 of them. But Devil in the White City was my favorite.
Wrote a book about Nazi Germany.
Maybe. I don't know.
And then he also wrote a book about the Titanic's sister ship, and that the name of that ship is.
It might have been the one about Nazi Germany, but I'm gonna have to look because now I'm gonna have to back up what I said here.
Thunderstruck is about the inventor of the telegraph, the wireless telegraph.
No, that wasn't it either. But I did really love Devil in the White City. H.H. Holmes was madman.
It's crazy. That's really unsupervised.
Oh, it's crazy. Like girls would just like go there to work and then just disappear.
Just like moved there from like Oklahoma to go.
It's crazy, and he was dragging around the kids with him all over the place. I mean, yeah, that's a whole story. If you're interested in like architecture and some of these like classic architects and like what that they like Olmsted that did the Biltmore House and
yeah. That's also why I can't pick one favorite book because I also read a book about Frank Lloyd, the architect, and that was like a totally separate book because he had a really wild history. Like someone burnt down his house and like part of his family was in there when it happened. It's like super, super sad. But he like is in the Devil in White City as one of the architects that are like brought in for. I like love the interaction.
And Olmsted, who did the Biltmore House here in North Carolina, yeah, super interesting. Devil in the White City, check it out. So we'll go with Devil in the White City for your book. It's a good choice.
No.
Okay, so all right, what's your deserted island book? If you had to be in a deserted island with one book that you could read forever, what's it going to be?
Like read over and over again?
Until you get sick of it and there's nothing else to read.
I've never reread a book.
I shared that stat with you recently until I reread Harry Potter again.
What?
I had never reread a book until I reread. I reread all of Harry Potter again.
I've never read Harry Potter.
You got to read it.
No. Or like the Hunger Games, or like, what would I reread? This, not a desert island book. I don't know, I need to think about that.
Okay.
I feel like I've read some books in my past that like I maybe wasn't able to like fully wrap my head around just because I was probably younger. Like some pop culture analysis that I'd like to come back to, but not over and over again. That'd be so dated after like a year or 2.
Fair enough. So historical, different time periods, different people. That's what interests you, and that makes sense because you deal with people, you deal with how where people are coming from and how they're going to transition, and so I mean it seems like everything kind of wraps up perfectly into your job title. That's amazing.
I told you it's all very intentional.
It seems
no
like
surprises here.
That's awesome. Just don't wash your diapers and let the ceiling flood it again.
Yes.
Well, Erinn, thank you so much for stopping by for an episode of Effortless Conversations. Thank you guys. Check in next week and we'll have another guest.